The water crisis in Indigenous communities across Canada. Historically and to this day, people rely on clean water for a variety of different human purposes, including consumption, hygiene, food production, rural development, etc. Drinking clean tap water is a privilege that most Canadians take too easily for granted, as it remains a fantasy for people in Indigenous communities across the country. For over 25 years, Indigenous people have been dealing with a water crisis in Canada. Although Canada is amongst one of the most water-rich countries around the globe, Indigenous people are hurting from the same issue that should have been dealt with many years ago. As Human Rights Watch points out, we in First Nation communities must have what Canadians take for granted: safe water and proper sanitation. Although there has been some progress and lots of promises made, there are far too many Indigenous people in Canada still living and dying in poverty because of their lack of access to safe and clean drinking water. Authorities issue notifications to the public when its drinking water supply has the potential or real health risk. They caution people to boil water, not to consume it, and not to use it. To understand the current state of the water crisis in Indigenous communities, it is important for us to look at some of the current statistics. As of September 20th, there are 61 long-term drinking water advisories in effect in 32 Indigenous communities across the country. The federal government has announced it won't end long-term advisories until 2023 at the earliest. However, in 2015, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau committed to ending all long-term drinking water advisories by March 2021. When that deadline passed, the government recommitted to ending long-term advisories without a target. This announcement comes as no surprise to many Indigenous people. They are outraged by the lack of progress on ending drinking water advisories in their communities and the growing divide and gap that exists between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. Examples of First Nation communities across Canada enduring persistent drinking water issues are endless. The water is not only safe to consume, but is unsanitary to bathe and shower in, as it causes cases of skin conditions, stomach illnesses, cancer, bacterial contamination, birth defects, and even deaths. Water advisories can also have mental health effects on First Nation community members, specifically when it comes to safety and cultural concerns. The Guardian News shares a story about Emily Wutong, the chief of Curve Lake, a small Indigenous community in southern Canada. She has lived there all 34 years of her life without access to clean water. She says, the emotional and spiritual damage of not having clean water and having to look at all of the water surrounding us on a daily basis but able to use it is almost unquantifiable. In her community, everyone is either treating their water or buying it bottled. Michael Curlew, a physician who is working within his community, stated that this is very common for patients to complain about their health due to the dirty water supply. Dr. Curlew mentions that at least a couple times a month, patients will say they feel that their water quality is making them sick. Curlew said that all Canadians need to have a look in the mirror and reflect on how their belief systems have been shaped by colonialization. Water crisis in Indigenous communities goes deeper than just drinking water advisories. All life requires water, and yet our global water supplies are quickly being dried up and polluted. The Indigenous people of North America have a special relationship with water built on our subsistence ways of life that extends back thousands of years. Their traditional activities depend on water for transportation, for drinking, cleaning, purification, and provides a habitat for the plants and animals they gather as medicine and food. Their ability to access water shapes these traditional activities and their relationships with their surroundings. Indigenous people recognize the sacredness of water, the interconnectedness of all life, and the importance of protecting the water from pollution, drought, and waste. In October 2021, more than 250 members of Neskatanga First Nations community were evacuated to Thunder Bay after an oily sheen was found on the reservoir. The discovery left the community without access to clean running water. When families are forced to leave the reserve because of unsafe drinking water and the lack of access to clean water, they become disassociated from the land which their culture grew from. Many Indigenous people seek to restore their traditional ways of protecting the health of water. An end to long-term advisories would be marked progress towards addressing these cultural issues. Indigenous land is much more than just an economic asset. Land is connected to spiritual beliefs, traditional knowledge, and teachings, and is fundamental to cultural reproduction. However, children who grow up on reserves with a boil water advisory associate their culture with the poor living conditions rather than appreciate their land for all that it is and the cultural value that it holds. For Indigenous people, losing land can mean losing lives. I have provided a short video to emphasize on the horrible conditions that many Indigenous people have to face on a daily basis. The overseeing of this tragic issue is the result of many years of marginalization and neglect. I believe we can trace this issue back to the start of the Indian Act in 1876. The Indian Act was a legislation that passed allowing the Canadian federal government to have power over all aspects of Indigenous people's lives, from dictating who could identify as a status Indian to placing restrictions on their traditions and, most harmful of all, robbing them of their land and resources. The Indian Act was in no way considered fair and was created as a means to control the Indigenous population. Some even consider this legislation a form of cultural genocide. This included the Canadian government having full control over the water supply that ran through Indigenous communities. Still to this day, Health Canada, a federal agency, only manages the water that is going to non-Indigenous communities to ensure it is safe and clean water, but fails to do the same for Indigenous communities. With that said, I believe the water crisis in Indigenous communities is a consequence of the years of systemic racism within our Canadian legal system, and the government needs to take responsibility in dealing with it. Indigenous people are constantly left with broken promises by the federal government of lifting all water advisories effective in Indigenous communities. The Canadian government failing their legal obligation to ensure safe drinking water to all Canadians is a violation of many human rights. As mentioned briefly before, there are no laws and regulations governing water supplies to Indigenous communities. The Liberal government has promised to solve the problem. However, the Indigenous population has seen no improvement. Drinking water is critical to survival, and with Canada being one of the largest holders of fresh water, it is unethical and inhumane that Indigenous people living in Canada do not have access to clean and safe drinking water.